The Kentucky wind found every gap in the aluminum shell of our trailer that February morning, but the cold pressing against my ribs had nothing to do with weather. I stood at the rusted mailbox fingers, wrapped around a cream-colored envelope thick enough to promise something hope or catastrophe, I couldn't tell which. The golden wax seal of Abernathy and Cole Law Firm caught the weak sunlight, and for 3 full seconds, I couldn't make myself break it open. The last time I'd held an envelope this heavy, it had been paperwork from the logging company explaining why they couldn't pay death benefits for Ryan. That had been 3 years ago, when I still believed official letters might contain good news. Brandon's voice cut through the moment, careful and quiet the way he'd learned to be since his father died. He stood in the trailer doorway with his backpack still strapped to his shoulders, 15 years old, and already carrying the weight of reading his mother's face for signs of collapse. "Mom, what is it?" My thumb slid under the seal. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." The paper inside was expensive, the kind of stationery that charged by the ounce, and my hands shook as I unfolded it. Could be nothing. But we both knew I was lying. Nothing in Millbrook arrived in envelopes like this, unless it was going to change your life, and changes in Millbrook generally meant losing whatever small thing you'd managed to keep. The first line hit like a fist. "Your presence is requested for the reading of Thomas Garrett's last will and testament. My father, dead." The letter gave me a date, a time, and an address in town, but no details about how or when he'd died. Just the formal language of inheritance law, as cold as the man himself had been during our last conversation 20 years ago. I'd been 18 then, newly married to Ryan Anderson, and my father had stood in the doorway of his workshop, telling me that if I walked out to build a life with a man he'd never approved of, I shouldn't bother coming back. I'd chosen Ryan. I'd chosen love over paranoia, over conspiracy theories about stolen patents and corporate theft, over my father's descent into isolation. And Thomas Garrett had kept his word. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a response, when I'd written to tell him Brandon had been born. 20 years of silence, and now this. Brandon shifted his backpack. "Grandpa Thomas." I nodded, still staring at the paper. The appointment was scheduled for Monday, 3 days away. That gave me exactly enough time to convince myself this was real and to start imagining what my father might have left me. It wouldn't be money. Thomas Garrett had spent his final decades living like a hermit in a shack, at the edge of the county, surviving on disability checks and whatever odd jobs he could still manage after the corporations blacklisted him. But maybe there was something. Maybe a few $1,000s in a forgotten account. Maybe enough to pay the 2 months of overdue electric bills, or to replace Brandon's winter coat that exposed 3 inches of wrist when he raised his arms. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. "I have to go to the lawyer's office Monday morning. Can you get yourself to school?" Brandon nodded. He'd been getting himself to school for 3 years now, ever since the double shift started. He knew the rhythm of our survival. My morning shift at Miller's Diner from 6 to 2, then the evening motel cleaning from 4 to midnight, when I could get the hours. He knew how to make dinner from whatever was in the pantry, how to do homework by flashlight when the power got shut off, how to smile at the church ladies who brought donation bags of clothes that never quite fit. He knew all of it, and he never complained, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. The Monday morning drive into Millbrook proper took 12 minutes along roads that hadn't been repaved since the 90s. The Abernathy and Cole office occupied a brick building on Main Street. The kind of place that still had brass nameplates and wooden shutters that actually worked. I parked my station wagon between a new Ford truck and a Mercedes, feeling the 38 years of my life compressed into the sound of my rusted door creaking open. My cleanest pair of jeans still had a faded stain on one knee from when I'd spilled bleach at the motel. My coat had been Ryan's, too big in the shoulders, the cuffs fraying. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who worked for $7 an hour plus tips and couldn't remember the last time she'd bought something that wasn't on sale. William Abernathy's office smelled like old books and furniture polish. The man himself was maybe 70, with silver hair and the kind of reading glasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He gestured to a leather chair across from his mahogany desk, and I sat down feeling like I was contaminating it. "Mrs. Anderson." He opened a folder, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered bad news to poor people before. "Thank you for coming. I'll be direct, as I understand your time is valuable." That was lawyer speak for knowing I was hourly and couldn't afford to sit through pleasantries. "Your father, Thomas Garrett, passed away 3 weeks ago. He was 76. As per his instructions, there was no funeral service. He'd been living alone in his property at the eastern edge of the county for the past 40 years. 3 weeks. My father had been dead for 3 weeks, and I'd spent that time pouring coffee and scrubbing toilets completely unaware that whatever complicated tangle of emotions connected us had been cut. I waited for grief, but what came instead was something more like exhaustion. Abernathy continued, his fingers tapping the folder. "Mr. Garrett's estate is unconventional. He liquidated what few traditional assets he possessed years ago. However, you are named as his sole heir, and as such, you inherit his remaining property." The word property made my pulse jump. Land. Even worthless land in Kentucky could be sold for something. Enough to catch up on the mortgage, enough to give Brandon a semester at community college. "What property?" Abernathy's expression shifted just slightly into something that might have been pity. "Parcel 402B. The deed will transfer to your name upon completion of the necessary paperwork. Locally, it's known as Ironwood Quarry." Every drop of blood drained from my face. I felt it go, felt the cold rush of understanding, felt the trap snap shut around my neck. Ironwood Quarry, the toxic wasteland at the bottom of a limestone gorge. 12 acres of poisoned water and 40 years of illegal dumping. Rusted cars and refrigerators and mountains of tires rotting in black water that stank of sulfur and chemicals. The place kids dared each other to go near on Halloween. The place even the county had given up on trying to clean because the cost was too astronomical and the responsibility too tangled in decades of deliberate neglect. My voice came out as a whisper. "You're saying the dump, the toxic lake. Legally, it's classified as a private recreational reservoir." Abernathy slid a stack of papers across the desk, and I saw red stamps on half of them. "Practically, yes. The Environmental Protection Agency conducted a satellite survey last year as part of a statewide contamination assessment. The county has issued preliminary findings." He tapped one of the documents. "As the new legal owner, Mrs. Anderson, you inherit not only the land, but also all associated environmental liabilities." The room tilted. "What does that mean?" "It means you are now legally responsible for the remediation of the site. The EPA has issued a 90-day compliance notice. If substantial progress toward cleanup is not demonstrated within that time frame, the county will begin levying fines of $1,000 per day. Those fines will continue until either the site is remediated or the property is seized to satisfy the accumulated debt. I stared at the papers, but the words had stopped making sense. Numbers swam in front of my eyes. Dollar amounts with too many zeros. How much would it cost? My voice didn't sound like mine. To clean it up. Abernathy's pause lasted too long. Preliminary estimates from the county engineer range between $300,000 and $500,000. That includes draining the quarry, excavating all submerged debris, treating contaminated soil, and restoring the site to EPA standards. $300,000. I made $14,000 a year when I could get enough hours. I had $800 in my checking account. I had a son who needed shoes and a future, and I had just inherited a debt so massive it would crush us both. I can't accept this. The words came fast, desperate. I don't want it. Can't I just refuse the inheritance? You can disclaim your inheritance, yes. However, Abernathy pulled out another document, this one stamped with the county seal. Your father accepted monetary compensation for allowing dumping on his property between 1978 and 1994. The county has documentation of those transactions. Legally, that makes this a commercial enterprise, not a personal residence. Under Kentucky environmental law, commercial liability transfers with the deed, regardless of whether the new owner accepts or disclaims. The moment your father died, you became responsible. Disclaiming simply means you receive no assets while retaining all liabilities. The trap was perfect. My father had built it 40 years ago, charging people $20 to dump their junk in his quarry, and now it had my name on it. I thought about asking why would Thomas Garrett do this to me? His only child, the daughter he disowned for choosing love over loneliness. But I already knew, because he was bitter, because he was angry at a world that had stolen his patents and ruined his career, because paranoia and isolation had hollowed him out until all that remained was the desire to make someone else hurt as much as he had. I signed the paperwork in a daze, my signature a forgery of compliance. Abernathy gave me copies and condolences in equal measure, and I walked out into the February morning, feeling like I'd just attended my own execution. The EPA notice was clear: 90 days to show substantial progress, or the fine started. 90 days to come up with $500,000, or lose everything. The trailer the land it sat on, Brandon's future, all of it would be seized to pay a debt I'd never earned. The news spread through Millbrook the way news always did in small towns, where everyone knew everyone's business, and most people took a certain joy in watching their neighbors fail. By the time I walked into Miller's Diner for my Tuesday morning shift, the whispers had already made 3 full circuits of the breakfast crowd. Jimmy Bates was holding court at the counter, his mechanic's coveralls still streaked with yesterday's grease. He saw me coming, and his grin widened into something mean. Well, look who it is. The Queen of Poison Lake herself. The diner went quiet. Linda, the manager, shot Jimmy a warning look from behind the register, but he ignored her. He was playing to an audience now, and half the booths had turned to watch. Heard you inherited prime real estate, Rebecca. 12 acres of toxic sludge and tetanus waiting to happen. You gonna build a resort? Call it Hazardous Haven. Laughter rippled through the room. I tied my apron on my hands steady, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. Just coffee today, Jimmy. Oh, come on, don't be like that. I'm just saying your old man really screwed you from beyond the grave. Must take talent to be that mean when you're already dead." More laughter. I poured his coffee, the mug clicking against the counter harder than I'd intended. The couple in booth 3 wouldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been leaving me decent tips for 2 years, suddenly found her menu fascinating. I'd become entertainment, a cautionary tale playing out in real time. Look at Rebecca Anderson, the waitress who inherited a nightmare. Look at how the universe just keeps kicking some people. The morning shift lasted 6 hours, and I don't remember a single order I took correctly. Linda pulled me aside around noon, her voice low and genuinely kind. "Honey, I heard about the quarry. I'm so sorry. If you need to take some time, I need the hours." I cut her off because kindness was harder to take than cruelty, and if she kept being gentle, I was going to break down in the middle of the lunch rush. "I can't afford time." She squeezed my arm and let me go back to work, but I felt her watching me for the rest of the shift, waiting to catch me when I finally fell apart. I drove out to Ironwood Quarry that Wednesday afternoon because I needed to see it again, needed to confirm that my memories weren't exaggerating the disaster. The access road was rutted dirt that threatened to tear the undercarriage off my station wagon. Bare trees pressed in on both sides, skeletal and dead, poisoned by decades of runoff. The gorge opened suddenly, a limestone bowl carved by glacier melt 10,000 years ago, and at the bottom that sat 12 acres of absolute ruin. The water was black, not dark blue or murky green, but genuinely black, as if someone had poured ink into a wound. The surface barely reflected light, absorbing it, instead turning the quarry into a void that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. The smell hit me even from the ridge sulfur and rust, and the chemical stink of decay. Methane bubbles broke the surface in lazy clusters. Along the shoreline, rusted car chassis jutted from the water at angles some half-submerged. Others tipped sideways like drunken monuments to waste. Refrigerators formed small, artificial islands. Tires, thousands of them, created floating barriers that shifted and knocked against each other in the wind. Washing machines, shopping carts. A school bus, its yellow paint flaked to primer windows, smashed out by rocks or bullets or time. And deeper out, where the quarry dropped to its full depth, the water was smooth and dark and heavy, with things I couldn't see. This was my inheritance. This was what my father had left me, not money or memories or anything that could be called love, but 12 acres of concentrated poison and a bill that would destroy what little life I'd managed to build. Quite a view, isn't it? I spun around. Donald Harper stood 15 feet away, his cashmere overcoat spotless against the dead landscape. He was maybe 55, silver hair, perfect, the kind of tan you got from golf courses and Caribbean vacations. Harper owned half the commercial real estate in the county and most of the strip malls within 30 miles. I'd seen him around town, always in restaurants that had wine lists, always with people who looked important. We'd never spoken. We existed in completely different Millbrooks. "Mr. Harper." I kept my voice neutral, wondering how he'd known I was here, wondering how long he'd been standing there watching me stare at my disaster. He picked his way down the slope with the careful steps of a man whose shoes cost more than my monthly rent. "I was hoping to run into you, Mrs. Anderson. Saved me a trip to that diner. I wanted to talk to you about your recent acquisition." The way he said acquisition made it sound like I'd won something instead of been buried alive. I waited. I own 300 acres of timberland adjacent to this gorge. Harper gestured east where the forest rose thick and dark. Premium hardwood, oak, hickory, walnut, worth a fortune to the right lumber operation. My problem is access. The county road curves 8 miles around to reach my property from the highway, but your land parcel 402B, it connects directly. A logging road straight through here would save me 2 years of permits and $500,000 in road construction. I understood where this was going, but I let him say it anyway. I want to buy Ironwood Quarry from you, Mrs. Anderson. I'm prepared to offer you $1,000 and assume all environmental liability. My company has the resources to bulldoze this mess, fill it with concrete, and pave right over it. Solves my problem, solves yours. Everyone wins. $1,000. Not even enough to cover the property taxes I'd just inherited along with the deed. I looked at Harper's smile at the calculation behind his friendly concern, and I saw exactly what was happening. He'd been waiting for this, waiting for my father to die, waiting for the liability to transfer to someone powerless, someone desperate enough to sign anything. He hadn't come here to help me. He'd come to steal my disaster for pennies and turn it into his profit. This land is worth more than $1,000. I kept my voice steady. Even poison the acreage alone is worth 50 times that. Harper's smile didn't waver, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Not with a $500,000 cleanup bill attached to it, it's not. Look around Rebecca. You're a waitress living in a trailer. You don't have the money to remediate this site. You don't have the connections to fight the EPA, and you're running out of time. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into something more honest, more cruel. Take the $1,000. Sign the deed over to me by Friday, or I'll just wait for the county to seize it and buy it from them at auction for even less. The choice is yours, but we both know there's only one choice you can actually afford to make. He walked back to his black SUV without waiting for an answer, tires spitting gravel as he drove away. I stood alone at the edge of the quarry, my father's legacy spreading out before me like a curse made manifest, and I understood that I was trapped. Harper was right. I couldn't fight this. I couldn't fix this. All I could do was surrender and hope $1,000 was enough to delay the inevitable collapse by a few more months. That night, I sat at our kitchen table with Harper's check lying next to a stack of overdue bills. The trailer was quiet except for the hum of the space heater we ran instead of the furnace because propane was expensive. Brandon should have been asleep, but I heard his door open, heard his footsteps in the narrow hallway. He stood in the doorway, wearing the same t-shirt he'd been wearing for 3 days because our laundry money had gone to groceries instead. His voice was flat final. You're not signing that. I looked up at my 15-year-old son, and I wanted to tell him that adults made hard choices, that survival sometimes meant surrender, that there was no shame in losing a fight you never had a chance to win. But before I could speak, Brandon walked to the table, picked up Harper's check, and tore it in half. Brandon. Grandpa Thomas wasn't stupid. He pulled a battered leather notebook from his jacket pocket and dropped it on the table hard enough to make the bills jump. I've been going out to Ironwood every day after school for the past week, since the moment you told me about the inheritance. My heart stopped. You did what, Brandon? That water is toxic. There's rusted metal diseases. I didn't go in the water. I found an old aluminum boat in the brush, dragged it to the shore. I've been rowing out taking measurements. He flipped open the notebook, and I saw pages covered in hand-drawn maps, depth calculations, grid coordinates marked in careful pencil. Mom, look at how the junk is distributed. I stared at the drawings, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like chaos cars and tires and appliances scattered across the quarry bed, like someone had thrown them at random. But Brandon's finger traced lines I hadn't noticed, connecting the dots. The cars, the tires, the washing machines, they're not just dumped randomly near the edges where trucks could back up and throw things in. They form a perimeter, a perfect ring around the deepest part of the quarry. Mom, some of these cars are 60 yards out. You can't throw a Chevy 60 yards. Someone dragged them out on barges or rafts and sank them deliberately. They're arranged. They're protecting something. I looked at my son's face, at the intensity burning there, and I felt the first flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Protecting what? Brandon turned the page. More calculations, angles, and depths, measured with fishing line and weights. I dropped a heavy magnet on a cord down into the center of the ring, the part that's surrounded by all the junk. The water there is 60 feet deep. The magnet didn't hit mud, Mom. It hit metal, a solid, flat, metallic structure, something huge. I measured it by moving the boat in a grid pattern. It's at least 80 feet long. I tried to make sense of what he was telling me. Your grandfather dumped metal down there. That's what you found. More junk. No. Brandon's voice carried absolute certainty. This isn't junk. Junk is random. This is engineered. The protective ring, the precise depth, the size of the structure. Mom, Grandpa didn't turn his land into a dump because he was crazy. He did it on purpose. He made sure nobody would ever want to look at what he actually hid at the bottom. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to explain that grief and conspiracy and the desperate need to believe your estranged grandfather might have left you something valuable instead of a catastrophe, could make you see patterns where there were none. But I looked at his maps, at the careful measurements, at the calculations he'd done with nothing but a fishing weight and a measuring tape and high school geometry, and I couldn't dismiss it. Because as much as I'd spent 20 years believing Thomas Garrett was paranoid and broken, I also knew he'd been brilliant once. A mechanical engineer who designed things nobody else could design, who'd worked for major corporations until something had fractured and he'd burned every bridge and retreated into isolation. What if Brandon was right? What if my father hadn't been dumping trash? What if he'd been burying secrets? I picked up Harper's torn check. The pieces felt like surrender, like the last chance at an easy way out. But I thought about the look in Harper's eyes, the calculation, the way he'd been so ready with his offer. How had he known to find me at the quarry? How had he known exactly when to make his pitch, unless he already knew something was down there? Unless he'd been waiting for years for Thomas Garrett to die so he could buy the land cheap and take whatever my father had hidden. If you're right, I started, but Brandon cut me off. I am right, Mom. I know I am, and we can't let Harper steal it. I looked at my son, and I made the kind of decision that divides a life into before and after. Then we need to find out what's down there. But Brandon, if we do this, if we go looking, we can't afford to be wrong. We're risking everything. He nodded, his jaw set with determination that reminded me painfully of his father. We're already risking everything. This way, at least we're fighting back. Over the next 3 days, Brandon and I became criminals by necessity. We couldn't hire professional salvage teams that would have required money permits and the kind of official attention that would bring Harper down on us immediately. So we learned to be thieves and scavengers instead, Brandon stole heavy fishing line from the tackle shop, took chain and rope from the hardware store's outdoor bins when no one was looking. I used my last credit card to buy a mechanical winch at a going-out-of-business sale, telling the clerk it was for a farm project. We were careful. We were desperate. We were out of time. Thursday night, we loaded everything into my station wagon and drove out to Ironwood under a moonless sky. The quarry looked even more threatening in darkness, the black water absorbing what little starlight made it through the clouds. Brandon had marked his coordinates with a makeshift buoy, a gallon jug tied to fishing line anchored with a spark plug. The boat was aluminum and ancient, the kind of thing someone had abandoned decades ago and that had somehow avoided rusting to pieces. We dragged it to the water's edge. "I'll row." Brandon was already moving toward the boat, but I grabbed his shoulder. "No. If something goes wrong, you need to be on shore where you can call for help. I'll do this." For a moment, I thought he'd argue, but then he nodded. We'd become a team of 2 against the world, and teams needed someone safe on shore. I climbed into the boat, feeling it rock under my weight, hearing water slosh against the hull. The oars were warped but functional. I pushed off from shore and started rowing toward the center of the quarry, toward the buoy that marked where Brandon's magnet had hit metal 60 feet down. The water was thicker than normal water, viscous with chemicals, and 40 years of decay. My oars cut through it with resistance, leaving swirls of oily rainbows on the surface. The smell was worse out here, not just sulfur, but something organic and rotten, like the quarry was digesting everything that had been fed to it. I tried not to think about what was under me, tried not to imagine all those rusted cars and refrigerators and the dark shapes they made in the depths. I reached the buoy and pulled in the oars. Brandon had rigged a grappling hook to heavy chain, the kind of thing you might use to pull a car out of a ditch. I lowered it over the side, paying out line from the winch we'd bolted to the boat's center bench. The chain hissed into the water, sinking fast. 20 feet, 30, 40. I kept feeding line, watching the numbers on the measuring tape we'd attached, waiting for the hook to hit bottom. 55 feet, 60. Then sudden resistance, the line going taut, the hook catching on something solid. I pulled, experimentally felt the immovable weight of whatever was down there. This wasn't mud. This wasn't a pile of tires. This was structure. I rowed back to shore with the chain still attached, the line stretching tight behind me like I was tethered to something vast and sleeping. Brandon helped me pull the boat onto the bank, and together we hooked the chain to the heavy winch we'd anchored to an old tractor axle half buried in the mud. The winch was mechanical, requiring pure physical effort to turn. No motor, no easy options. Just a crank handle and the promise that applied force could move immovable things. "We pull together," I said, positioning myself at the handle. "On 3. We threw our weight against the crank. It resisted, then grudgingly turned. The chain groaned, shedding water, pulling taut enough to hum. We cranked again and again. Our hands blistered. Our backs screamed. The winch mechanism ratcheted with metallic clicks that echoed across the gorge. I lost track of time. All that existed was the next turn of the handle. The next foot of chain reeled in the slow, impossible work of pulling something from the depths. Then the water broke. At first, I thought it was just waves, just disturbance from the pressure. But then I saw it, a dark shape breaching the surface, shedding water, and algae rising like something prehistoric. Not rusted, not decayed. Gleaming dully through the mud and growth was stainless steel unmarred by 40 years underwater. A case. A massive transit case, rectangular, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The kind of container designed to survive shipwrecks and plane crashes and anything else that might try to destroy what was inside. We pulled harder. The case tilted water streaming from its sealed edges, and then it was at the shore, solid and impossibly heavy, covered in barnacles and sludge, but intact. I fell to my knees in the mud lungs, burning, unable to believe what we'd done. Brandon scrambled to the case, pulling out bolt cutters from his backpack. The locks were brass-old, but still functional, each one the size of my fist. Wait. My voice was hoarse. What if it's dangerous? What if there are chemicals inside? Brandon ignored me. He cut the first lock with a crack like a gunshot, then the second, then the third. He jammed a crowbar under the rubber seal and threw his weight backward. There was a moment of resistance, then a violent hiss of escaping pressurized air that had been sealed in this case for decades, proof that whatever was inside had been protected from the water, from time, from everything. The lid swung open. I crawled forward, looking over Brandon's shoulder and into the case. No chemicals, no toxic waste, no garbage. Resting inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and cradled in custom-cut foam, was something so unexpected that my brain couldn't process it at first. Chrome and crimson enamel, hand-stitched leather. Mechanical perfection preserved in an oxygen-free environment, like a museum piece. Brandon pulled back the canvas with shaking hands. Oh my God. It was a motorcycle. Not just any motorcycle, but something that looked like it had rolled off an assembly line yesterday, despite being older than I was. I didn't know anything about vintage bikes, but even I could see this was special. The chrome was flawless. The paint was deep and glossy. The odometer showed 0 miles. Every bolt was hand-machined. Every piece of leather had been tooled by someone who cared about their craft. This wasn't transportation. This was art. 1939 Bro Superior SS100. Brandon read from a small plate on the engine. Mom, this is like the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles. These things are worth... He didn't finish because he'd found the smaller wooden boxes packed around the motorcycle, each one sealed in wax, each one heavy. He pried the lid off the first box, and we both stopped breathing. Watches. Dozens of them. Each in its original velvet case. Each looking like it had been purchased yesterday. Brass and gold and stainless steel, gleaming in our flashlight beams. Rolex. Patek Philippe. Names I recognized from magazine ads, but had never imagined holding. And below the watches in the bottom of the case were heavy cloth bags that clinked when Brandon lifted them. He untied one and poured its contents into his palm. Gold coins. Thick, heavy, perfect. $20 pieces with eagles stamped on them, dates from the 1920s, dozens of them in just this one bag. And there were more bags. So many more. I sat back in the mud, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. This was too much, too valuable, too perfectly preserved. But it was real. It was sitting in front of me, pulled from 60 feet of toxic water, hidden by my father, under a mountain of garbage so nobody would ever think to look for it. Brandon's voice was barely a whisper. The magnet hit an 80-foot structure, Mom. This case, it's maybe 6 feet long. This isn't the main thing. This fell off something bigger. Grandpa didn't just hide a motorcycle. He buried a treasure ship down there. And Donald Harper knows. He has to know. That's why he showed up so fast. That's why he only offered $1,000. He's been waiting for this. I looked at the gold, at the watches, at the motorcycle that probably cost more than my trailer, and I felt something crack open inside me. Not quite hope, not yet, but something fiercer. My father hadn't abandoned me. He'd protected me the only way his broken, paranoid mind knew how. He'd buried his life's work, his proof, his value under a disaster so toxic that nobody would ever willingly dig through it. And he'd left it to me, trusting that I was stubborn enough to look past the poison to find the truth. But as I stared at our discovery, I also understood that we'd just made ourselves targets. Harper wanted this land desperately enough to lie, to manipulate, to wait years for his chance. When he found out what we'd pulled from the depths, and he would find out, because secrets in Millbrook had a half-life of about 12 hours, he wouldn't just offer money anymore. He'd use lawyers' influence, every ounce of power a rich man had, to crush a poor woman who'd stumbled onto something valuable. We hide it. I made the decision fast. Right now, before anyone sees. We dragged the case deeper into the brush, covered it with tarps and branches, rolled a rusted refrigerator in front of it to make it look like more abandoned junk. The work took 2 hours, and by the time we finished, dawn was starting to gray the eastern sky. We drove home in silence, both of us too exhausted and too wired to speak. But before we'd left the quarry, I'd done one thing. I'd opened one of those velvet watch cases and slipped it into my coat pocket. A single Rolex, pristine and valuable and potentially our salvation. Because I'd learned something in that long night of pulling secrets from darkness. My father had been right about the world being against him, about corporations stealing and people lying and survival requiring extreme measures. And if I was going to fight Donald Harper, if I was going to protect Brandon and honor what Thomas Garrett had left us, I needed to become someone I'd never been before. I needed to become ruthless, strategic, willing to gamble everything on a secret buried under poison. The kitchen table held Harper's torn check and my pile of overdue bills. I set the watch case next to them, opened it under the weak light of our single working lamp, and looked at the most valuable thing I'd ever held. Tomorrow, I would find out exactly how much it was worth. Tomorrow, I would begin the transformation from victim to fighter. Tomorrow, I would stop letting this world take everything from me. But tonight, I sat with my son, and we let ourselves imagine, just for a moment, that the future might hold something other than defeat. I didn't sleep that night. The velvet watch case sat on my kitchen counter catching the pre-dawn light, and every time I looked at it, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just a valuable antique. It was evidence. Part of a collection my father had assembled, with purpose, each piece chosen for a reason I didn't yet understand. Selling it meant destroying whatever pattern he'd created, whatever story these objects were meant to tell together. But keeping it meant losing everything while I tried to decode a dead man's intentions. Brandon found me at 5 a.m, still staring at the Rolex through its crystal case. He'd showered and dressed in his cleanest clothes, the khakis that were too short and the button-down shirt from Goodwill that almost fit. "I'm coming with you." I wanted to argue to protect him from whatever happened next, but I was done pretending I could handle this alone. "You'll miss school." "Mom, we pulled a fortune out of a toxic lake last night. I think I can miss one day of algebra." The drive to Lexington took 2 hours through mountain roads that twisted between bare trees and scattered farmhouses. I'd called ahead to 3 estate jewelry dealers, settling on Mendel and Sons Fine Horology, because their website promised discretion and immediate payment for exceptional pieces. The store occupied a brick building near the university, the kind of place with security cameras and reinforced glass and buzzer entry. I parked between a Lexus and a BMW, feeling my station wagon announce exactly how desperate we were. Inside smelled like money furniture polish and leather, and the particular silence that comes when everything around you costs more than you make in a year. Isaac Mendel looked up from a workbench behind bulletproof glass, his jeweler's loupe still pressed to his eye. He was maybe 70, silver beard, trimmed precise hands, steady as he set down whatever he'd been examining. His eyes took in my coat, my worn jeans, Brandon's too short pants, and I watched him make calculations about how much he could lowball us. "How can I help you?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. The velvet case clicked against the glass counter when I set it down, opened it without ceremony. The Rolex sat there catching the overhead lights, throwing tiny rainbows across the display case. Mendel stopped breathing. His hand moved slowly, almost reverently, as he lifted the watch with white cotton gloves I hadn't seen him put on. He carried it to his workbench, positioned it under a high-intensity lamp, and bent close with his loupe. The silence stretched so long, I started counting my heartbeats. 93. 94. 95. His voice came out hushed, careful, like he was afraid speaking too loud might make the watch disappear. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Anderson. Rebecca Anderson. Mrs. Anderson, where did you acquire this piece? I'd practiced the lie on the drive. It's a family heirloom. My father was a collector. He passed recently, and I'm liquidating part of his estate to cover expenses. Not entirely false. Just missing the part about pulling it from 60 feet of poisoned water after my father had hidden it for 40 years under a mountain of garbage. Mendel turned the watch over, examining the caseback, the lugs, every microscopic detail. His breathing had changed, gotten faster, the kind of excitement that even professional restraint couldn't fully hide. This is a 1958 Rolex Submariner, reference 6538. The James Bond Big Crown. His gloved finger traced the bezel. Original radium dial. The luminous material still present, which is exceptionally rare. The case shows no signs of polishing. The bevels on the lugs are still sharp. The bezel insert is flawless. Mrs. Anderson, this watch has never been worn. I've been in this business 42 years, and I've never seen a 6538 in this condition outside of photographs from the Rolex archives. Brandon leaned forward, his voice careful. What's it worth? Mendel set the watch down like it was made of glass. At auction, with proper provenance documentation, easily $80,000 to $100,000, possibly more given the unpolished condition. Collectors pay premiums for pieces this pristine. The number hit me like physical force. $100,000. I'd been hoping for 20, maybe 30. Enough to buy time, but this was enough to change everything. Enough to hire professionals to fight Harper legally, to give Brandon a future that didn't involve choosing between electricity and food. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I can't wait for an auction. I'm facing foreclosure. I need cash, and I need it discreetly. What's your direct buyout offer? Mendel's eyes sharpened. He recognized desperation when he saw it, and desperation meant leverage. He wanted this watch badly enough that I could see him calculating how low he could go while still getting me to sign. I can wire $45,000 to your account within the hour. It's well below market value, but it's immediate liquid capital and completely private. No auction house fees, no publicity, no questions about estate taxes or provenance. $45,000. Still more money than I'd ever imagined having at once. Still not enough to remediate Ironwood, but enough to hire a lawyer to pay property taxes for years, to buy the equipment and expertise we'd need to pull up whatever else my father had buried. Brandon's hand found mine under the counter, squeezed once. I squeezed back and made the decision that would divide my life into before and after. Deal. The paperwork took 30 minutes. Bank routing numbers, authentication certificates, proof of ownership through my father's estate. Mendel's hands never stopped shaking slightly as he photographed the watch from every angle, logged it into his inventory system, prepared the wire transfer. By 10:30 Friday morning, my phone buzzed with a notification that $45,000 had appeared in my checking account that had held $800 yesterday. We drove back toward Millbrook in silence, both of us trying to process what had just happened. I kept checking my phone's banking app, convinced the number would disappear, that this was some mistake or dream. But it stayed real. $45,000. Not salvation, but possibility. The county clerk's office opened at noon on Fridays. I'd timed this carefully wanted Harper to spend all morning assuming I'd given up that I'd be arriving to sign his buyout papers with my head down and my spirit broken. Instead, I walked in at 12:15 with a certified cashier's check for $14,000 and paperwork that would redefine the entire game. Harper was already there, leaning against the counter like he owned the building, laughing with Mayor Higgins about something that was probably at my expense. He saw me walk in, and his smile widened into something predatory. He'd dressed for victory, tailored suit silk tie, leather briefcase that probably cost more than my car. This was supposed to be the moment I surrendered. I walked straight past him to the clerk's window and set down my check. The clerk, a woman named Martha, who'd gone to high school with my mother, looked at the amount and her eyebrows climbed. I'm paying property taxes on Parcel 402B for the next 5 years, in full, and I'm filing an official notice of private remediation plan. The city's 90-day compliance deadline is suspended under Kentucky Environmental Statute 224. 46-580, which allows property owners to self-remediate if they can demonstrate adequate funding and approved methodology. Martha looked past me to Harper, then back to the check, then to the stack of forms I'd spent 3 hours last night preparing, with help from every free legal resource website I could find. Harper's smile had frozen on his face. Mayor Higgins had gone quiet. This is legitimate. Martha stamped the first form, her voice rising with what might have been approval. You're current on taxes through 2030, and you've submitted preliminary environmental assessment documentation. The EPA fine schedule is officially suspended pending review of your remediation proposal. Harper pushed off the counter and crossed the floor fast enough that I had to resist the urge to step back. His voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. Where did you get that kind of money? I met his eyes and let him see that I was done being scared. That's none of your business, Mr. Harper. And if I catch your surveyors on my property again, I'll have Sheriff Moore arrest them for criminal trespassing Parcel 4. O2B is private land undergoing authorized environmental restoration. You have no claim to it. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Donald, she's within her rights. If she's got funding to clean the site herself, this is bullshit. Harper's voice went low dangerous, the kind of tone men use when they're not used to being denied. "You had $800 in your bank account 3 days ago. Don't think I didn't check. You're pulling money from somewhere, and when I find out what you're really doing out there, Rebecca, you're going to wish you'd taken my offer." His use of my first name was meant to intimidate, to remind me that he had resources to investigate me, to dig into my life. But I'd spent 3 years watching people I served coffee to treat me like furniture. I'd survived losing my husband and raising a son alone and choosing between heat and food. Donald Harper in an expensive suit was just another person underestimating me. "Get off my land." I picked up my stamped receipts and walked out, leaving him standing in the county clerk's office with his mouth open and his victory turned to ash. Brandon was waiting in the parking lot, and when he saw my face, he started laughing, the first real, unguarded laugh I'd heard from him in years. We sat in my car and let the relief wash over us. We'd bought time. Not much, maybe 30 days before Harper found a new angle, but time was all we needed because we had $45,000 minus the $14,000 for taxes, which left $31,000 to hire the kind of help that could pull the rest of my father's secrets into daylight. Finding Jeffrey Morrison took 2 days of phone calls and dead ends. Commercial divers weren't exactly common in landlocked Kentucky, and the ones I found either wanted too much money or asked too many questions. Then Brandon found a forum post from 3 years ago, a retired oil rig worker, discussing underwater salvage techniques in hazardous environments, mentioning he'd moved to Charleston after an accident damaged his inner ear. One phone call to the Charleston 5A office, $20 slipped to a helpful secretary, and I had an address. Jeffrey Morrison lived in a double-wide trailer on 5 acres of scrubland east of the city. The property was clean but sparse, the kind of place a man maintains when he's got time but not much money. I parked next to a truck that had seen better decades, and before I could knock, the door opened. Morrison was maybe 60, skin-tanned leather dark, from years on outdoor rigs, a scar running from his left ear, down his neck, like someone had opened him up and put him back together wrong. He looked at me and Brandon with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by strangers showing up unannounced. "If you're selling something I'm not buying." "I'm not selling. I'm hiring." I held up the manila folder I'd prepared. "I need someone with deep water salvage experience in toxic environments. Someone who doesn't ask questions and doesn't talk about what they find. Someone who can work for cash and operate in legally gray areas." Morrison leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "And you thought of me, why? Because you're good. You're available and you're not working for any of the big salvage companies anymore. Your service record says you did commercial diving for 20 years before the accident. That makes you qualified. Your current employment status makes you desperate enough to take the job." He studied me for a long moment, and I watched him make the same calculations I'd made with Mendel, trying to figure out how much leverage he had, how desperate I really was, what kind of trouble I was bringing to his door. "What's the job?" 60-foot dive into a contaminated quarry lake. Black water, near freezing temperature, zero visibility. There's a steel structure on the bottom, railcar size, maybe bigger. It's locked. I have the combination. I need you to get inside and hook retrieval lines to whatever's stored there. I'm offering $16,000 cash for 3 nights of work. Morrison's eyebrows went up. "Normal rate for hazardous salvage is $25,000 to $30,000. "I know, but $16,000 is what I have after paying my property taxes and filing environmental paperwork. You can take it and we both walk away richer, or you can decline and I'll find someone less qualified who'll do it for $12,000. He laughed, sharp and surprised. "You've got stones, I'll give you that." Where's this quarry? Ironwood, outside Millbrook. His expression changed recognition flickering across his face. That toxic shithole lady, you know what's in that water? Chemical runoff, heavy metals, probably enough bacteria to give you sepsis just from skin contact. I'd need a full hazmat diving rig, not just scuba gear. Do you have one? Yeah, but then the question is whether $16,000 is enough to compensate you for the risk, because I'm not negotiating up, and I'm running out of time to find someone else. Morrison pushed off the doorframe and walked into his trailer, leaving the door open. I took it as invitation and followed Brandon close behind. The interior was cluttered with diving equipment, maintenance tools, and technical manuals stacked on every surface. He pulled a beer from the fridge, offered me one, and when I declined, he took a long drink and stared at me over the bottle. What's really down there? Truth? It was the most honest answer I could give. My father spent 40 years hiding something under enough garbage that nobody would look for it. I need to know what it was. He finished the beer and crushed the can in one hand. When do we start? We loaded Morrison's equipment into his truck. Sunday evening, he wouldn't let me see most of it. Said I'd just get in the way, but I caught glimpses of heavy rubber suits, brass helmets with mounted lights, oxygen tanks marked with hazard warnings. He drove separately to Ironwood, arriving after dark when the risk of witnesses was lowest. Brandon and I met him at the access road with flashlights and the hand-drawn maps showing where we'd found the first case. Morrison spent 20 minutes on shore with his side-scan sonar equipment, a portable unit that looked military surplus. He ran the sensor drone through the water in a grid pattern, while we huddled around a laptop screen in the back of his truck, watching ghost images resolve into structure. Well, I'll be damned. His voice carried professional appreciation. Your kid was right. That's a decommissioned heavy-gauge steel railcar, probably 60 to 80 feet long. Looks like someone floated it out here on a barge, filled it with ballast, and scuttled it deliberately. He zoomed the image, enhancing details. And that perimeter ring of junk that's not random dumping, that's a defensive barrier. Whoever sank this thing wanted to make sure nobody could easily access it. Rusted car chassis welded together aisles pointing up to snag grappling hooks and tear up diving equipment. Your father was paranoid, but he was also smart. Brandon leaned over the screen. Can you get past it? Yeah, but it'll take time, and there's the bigger problem. Morrison pointed to a detail on the sonar image. See this? That's a reinforced bulkhead door with what looks like a locking wheel mechanism. Military-grade waterproof seal. Even if I get to it, I can't cut through that underwater without flooding whatever's inside. I pulled the property deed from my jacket, the document I'd been carrying since the day this started. The surveyor's addendum was highlighted in yellow marker. Subsurface mineral rights require manual calibration at strict degrees 42 north 18 west 61 east. Morrison read it twice, then looked at me. That's not geological terminology. There are no mineral rights on a limestone quarry, and you don't calibrate property lines with compass degrees. No. Brandon's voice carried quiet certainty, but you do open combination locks. Left 42 right, 18 left 61. The silence that followed was broken only by night insects and the distant sound of the quarry water lapping against the shore. Morrison set down his beer and smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something almost joyful. Your father hid the combination in the property deed. Son of a bitch. He stood up, already reaching for his diving suit. Get that winch system set up. If the combination works, we're pulling up whatever's in that railcar tonight. Watching Morrison prepare to dive, was like watching a surgeon prep for surgery, every movement precise, every piece of equipment checked twice. The hazmat drysuit was thick rubber reinforced with Kevlar panels. The brass helmet looked like something from an old naval movie, heavy and sealed with a collar mechanism that locked with mechanical certainty. Lights mounted on top two-way radio built into the interior, breathing apparatus connected to dual oxygen tanks on his back. He moved through the preparation with practiced efficiency, and when he was ready, he looked less like a man and more like a deep-sea machine designed to survive environments that would kill normal humans. "Radio check." His voice crackled through the speaker Brandon held. "You hear me? Clear. Good. I'm going to be down there 40 to 50 minutes. Visibility will be absolute zero. I'll be working entirely by feel and helmet sonar. If I say pull me up, you pull immediately. No arguments, no delays. Understood." I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me through the helmet. "Understood." Morrison walked into the water, each step deliberate, testing his footing. The black surface swallowed him slowly, first his legs, then his torso, then his shoulders. The helmet lights created a diffuse glow beneath the surface for a few seconds, and then he was gone, leaving only bubbles and the umbilical cord of his airline trailing into the depths. Brandon and I sat by the radio speaker, listening to Morrison's breathing echo, mechanical and steady through the connection. The sound was hypnotic, inhuman, a rhythm that marked time in a place where normal time had stopped meaning anything. Descending. 20 feet. Temperature dropping fast. Visibility zero, like swimming through ink. More breathing. The hiss of regulators. Occasionally, metallic tapping as Morrison's helmet hit something in the dark. 35 feet, hitting the junk ring now. Jesus, this is a maze. Cars welded chassis to chassis, creating a wall of rusted metal and jagged edges. Your father really didn't want anyone getting through here easily. I held my breath, waiting for disaster, for Morrison to snag his suit, tear his airline, get trapped in the twisted metal graveyard my father had constructed. Navigating over. It's like climbing through a junkyard in complete darkness while wearing a spacesuit. Slow going. 10 minutes of breathing. 10 minutes of my heart hammering against my ribs. 10 minutes of Brandon gripping my hand so tight my fingers went numb. "Okay, I'm through. Dropping into the central trench. 50 feet, 55, 60, I've got bottom." "Do you see the rail car?" Brandon's voice cracked on the question. "Kid, I don't see anything, but I'm touching it." Steel hull coated in thick, rubberized epoxy. Whoever prepared this for submersion did it right. This thing was built to sit underwater for a century without corroding. Moving along the port side, feeling for the door. More breathing. The rasp of Morrison's glove against metal transmitted through the radio as eerie scratching sounds. Found it. Heavy bulkhead door, just like the sonar showed. There's a wheel mechanism in the center, and yeah, I can feel the combination dial. Brass solid construction machined right into the locking system. Okay, giving the combination a try. Left to 42. The clicking of the dial turning underwater came through distorted, almost musical. Set. Right to 18. Click, click, click. Set. Left to 61. The longest silence of my life. I stopped breathing. Brandon's hand crushed mine. Even the night insects seemed to pause. Then, Morrison's voice came through, hushed with disbelief and something like reverence. Holy hell, it worked. The combination worked. The locking bolts are retracting. I can feel the mechanism releasing. "Rebecca, I'm opening the door." A sound like thunder transmitted through the radio metal, groaning water rushing, decades of pressure equalizing. Then Morrison was laughing, the sound strange and distorted through the helmet speakers. "Water's flooding the vestibule, but there's a mesh gate creating a second barrier." Smart design. Behind the gate, the main cargo area is sealed separately, and it's packed. I can see shapes through the mesh, multiple large containers, military-grade transit cases stacked and strapped to floor grating. They're suspended above the railcar floor, kept dry even though we're 60 feet underwater. This is beautiful engineering. "Can you reach them?" My voice barely worked. "Yeah, but I need to cut through this mesh gate first. Give me 5 minutes." We waited, listening to Morrison work. The rasp of a cutting tool, grunts of effort, the ping of metal giving way. Then, "First case is accessible. I'm cutting the straps, holding it down. These things are positively buoyant, designed to float if a ship sinks. Soon as I free it, it's going to want to rise. I'm hooking it to the winch cable now." "Rebecca, when I give the word, start reeling. Keep tension steady. Don't let it swing wild, or it might snag on the junk ring coming up." "Ready." "Okay, straps cut. Case is loose. Rising fast, got it clipped. Reel it in." I threw my weight against the winch handle, Brandon beside me, both of us cranking with everything we had. The cable went taut, water streaming off it as it rose. The resistance was enormous, fighting not just weight, but water pressure and the suction of the bottom. My hands blistered. My back screamed. I didn't care. We cranked and cranked and cranked. The surface broke with a sound like a small explosion, water sheeting off titanium that gleamed even in the darkness. The case was massive, at least 6 feet long, and 3 wide, completely unmarred by 40 years of submersion. We wrestled it onto the shore muscles, shaking lungs, burning. Morrison surfaced 5 minutes later, hauling himself out of the water and stripping off his helmet. His face was flushed with exertion and excitement, the kind of expression I imagined looked on people who just climbed mountains or discovered lost cities. "There are at least 10 more cases down there. Same size, same type. If they're all as well sealed as this one, whatever's inside is going to be pristine." He looked at me with new respect. "Your father didn't just hide valuables, Rebecca. He created a time capsule, an archive. Whatever he put down there, he wanted it to survive everything." We opened the case together, Morrison using a pry bar on the industrial latches. The seal hissed when it broke, pressurized air escaping, and then we were looking inside at foam-wrapped bundles and vacuum-sealed bags that looked like they'd been packaged yesterday. Gold bars. The first thing I saw was gold heavy stamped official. 10-ounce bars from Swiss refineries, 50 of them arranged in neat rows. Brandon pulled one out, and it caught the flashlight beam with the kind of gleam that meant purity, value, wealth that couldn't be inflated away or taxed into nothing. Below the gold were coin holders, the rigid plastic kind that preserved condition. Morrison cracked one open and poured $20 gold pieces into his palm, double eagles from the 1920s, each one worth thousands to collectors. There were hundreds of them, but it was what lay beneath the gold and coins that made my hands start shaking. Documents. Folders wrapped in waterproof plastic, sealed with desiccant packets that had kept them dry for 4 decades. I tore one open carefully and pulled out a sheaf of papers that smelled like old ink and desperation. Engineering blueprints, patent applications, test results, correspondence on corporate letterhead, and on top of everything, a leather journal with my father's name embossed on the cover. I opened the journal, my flashlight beam illuminating handwriting I hadn't seen in 20 years. The first entry was dated January 1982. They stole my design today. I presented the deep-water valve prototype to the engineering board at Peterson Oil and Gas. They were enthusiastic, called it revolutionary. 2 weeks later, they terminated my employment, claiming I'd breached my contract by conducting unauthorized research during company time. But I know what they're doing. They're going to file the patent under the company name, cut me out of royalties, steal 40 months of my work. I kept copies of everything. I will prove this theft. Entry after entry chronicled my father's fight. Lawyer consultations that went nowhere. Patent office rejections citing prior art that didn't exist when he'd filed. Corporate stonewalling and threats. The careful documentation of a man watching his life's work being stolen in slow motion while everyone told him he was paranoid. The entries got shorter, more fragmented as the months turned to years. But the last entry, dated March 1985, was written in handwriting that looked almost peaceful. I'm sealing everything at Ironwood today. The gold is insurance, something Rebecca can sell if she needs immediate funds. The patents and blueprints are proof. Evidence that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't a thief, that everything they said about me was a lie. I'm leaving it all to Rebecca. We haven't spoken in 3 years. I know I drove her away with my anger, with my obsession, with my inability to be the father she needed. But she's stronger than I ever was, smarter, more capable of fighting the world without letting it break her. If anyone can expose the truth and reclaim what was stolen, it's my daughter. I love you, Sarah. I'm sorry I never learned how to say it while I could still look you in the eye. Forgive me for leaving you this burden, but I had no one else to trust with the truth. I realized I was crying when Brandon put his arm around me. Morrison had stepped back, giving us space, this stranger who'd just helped us pull my father's broken heart out of the dark. I cried for the man Thomas Garrett had been before paranoia consumed him. I cried for the daughter who'd chosen love over loyalty and spent 20 years believing she'd been right to walk away. I cried because I'd been wrong. My father hadn't abandoned me. He'd protected me the only way his damaged mind could conceive, by burying proof so deep that only someone desperate and stubborn enough would dig for it. Morrison cleared his throat. We should get the other cases tonight if we can. I don't know how much time we have before Harper figures out what we're doing, but every case we pull up is one he can't claim if he gets a court order. We worked through the night. Morrison dove twice more each time, hooking another titanium case to the winch cable, each time surfacing exhausted and exhilarated. We pulled up 3 cases total before Morrison called it, his voice rough with fatigue, and the beginnings of hypothermia that even the dry suit couldn't fully prevent. The 3 cases sat on the shore like stolen treasure from a shipwreck. We loaded them into Morrison's truck, covered them with tarps, and drove them to his property where he had a secure barn. Opening them would have to wait for daylight and proper tools, but I could feel the weight of what we'd accomplished settling onto my shoulders. We'd beaten the quarry. We'd opened my father's vault. We'd found not just gold and valuables, but something more important, proof that Thomas Garrett had been right all along. Morrison dropped us at our trailer as dawn was breaking, and Brandon and I stumbled inside like survivors of a shipwreck. We were covered in mud and quarry water, smelling like sulfur and industrial chemicals, too tired to speak. But as I collapsed onto my bed, still wearing my filthy clothes, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Not the desperate, foolish kind that pretends everything will work out, but the fierce, earned kind that comes from fighting the darkness and dragging something valuable into the light. My father had left me proof. Now, I just had to figure out how to use it. I woke to pounding on the trailer door 6 hours later. Through the window, I could see Sheriff Kenneth Moore's cruiser, parked next to my station wagon, lights off, but radio crackling with dispatch noise. My heart dropped. Harper had moved faster than I'd expected, found some legal angle to shut us down before we could secure everything we'd found. But when I opened the door, Moore didn't have his hand on his gun. He looked uncomfortable holding a thick stack of papers, his expression apologetic. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm sorry to bother you this early, but I've got papers here from Donald Harper's legal team. Emergency injunction signed by Judge Reynolds an hour ago." I took the documents, my hand steady, despite the fear climbing my spine. The legalese was thick, but the meaning was clear enough. Harper had filed an emergency petition with the State Environmental Board, claiming my diving operations at Ironwood were disturbing toxic sediments and threatening the county's groundwater supply. The injunction ordered immediate cessation of all salvage activities. The state would send environmental inspectors to assess the site, and if they determined remediation was necessary, they'd invoke eminent domain and seize the property. "When are the inspectors coming?" My voice came out calm, detached, like I was asking about weather. "Official schedule says 3 to 5 days, but Harper's got connections with the state board. Could be as early as tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to pull up the remaining cases or lose everything to Harper's legal maneuvering. I looked at Moore, this man who'd been sheriff for 20 years, who'd known my husband, who'd written the accident report that had made me a widow. He wasn't enjoying this. He was just doing his job, caught between a rich man's lawyers and a poor woman's desperation. "Are you here to stop me from going back to my property?" "The injunction says you can't conduct any more diving operations, but it doesn't say you can't be on your own land." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Rebecca, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that if you violate this order, Harper will have grounds to have you arrested. And if the inspectors show up and find active salvage work, they'll issue a full site lockdown." "How much time do I have before that happens?" Moore checked his watch. "Inspectors are scheduled to arrive at 6 a.m. tomorrow. That's..." He calculated. 18 hours from now. But Rebecca, even if you could pull something up in that time, Harper's going to claim it as abandoned property found during state seizure. You'd be tied up in court for years trying to prove ownership." He left me with the papers and a look that might have been sympathy. I stood in my doorway watching his cruiser disappear down the dirt road, holding an injunction that was designed to corner me, to force me into submission or arrest. Harper had played this perfectly. He'd given me just enough rope to hang myself. If I violated the order by diving again, he could have me jailed. If I didn't, he'd use the state inspectors to seize the property and claim everything we'd found as environmental salvage. Brandon appeared at my shoulder, reading over my arm. When he finished, he didn't look scared. He looked angry. "We go back tonight. One more dive. We pull up everything we can before the deadline. If we get caught, I could go to jail. You could end up in foster care. If we don't try, Harper wins. He takes everything Grandpa hid and we're right back where we started. Broke, powerless, waiting for the world to crush us." His voice carried the kind of certainty that only comes from being 15 and too young to understand how badly things can go wrong. "Mom, we didn't come this far to give up now." He was right, of course. But rightness and wisdom weren't the same thing, and as I looked at the injunction in my hands, I understood that we'd crossed into territory where winning and losing had stopped being about money. This was about whether I was the kind of person who fought even when fighting meant risking everything, or the kind who surrendered to powerful men because surrender was safer than defiance. I made the call to Morrison before I could talk myself out of it. His voice was rough with sleep when he answered. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" "Harper got an injunction. State inspectors arrive tomorrow at 6 a.m. We have 18 hours to pull everything we can." Silence. Then, "That's not enough time. Even working straight through, I'd need to make 5, maybe 6 dives. That's dangerous, Rebecca. Decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, equipment failure, any of those could kill me." "I know. I'm not asking you to do it. I'm telling you what I'm going to attempt with or without you and offering you the chance to help if you want the rest of the money I promised." More silence. Then Morrison laughed, the sound tired and resigned, and somehow proud. "You've got stones, lady. I'll be there in 2 hours. But, Rebecca, if I die down there, make sure my sister gets my truck. It's all I've got worth leaving anyone." We met at Ironwood as the sun was setting, the gorge filling with shadows that turned the black water into something ancient and hungry. Morrison had brought a second set of diving equipment, backup tanks, extra lights. He worked through his prep with grim efficiency, a man who'd made peace with whatever might happen next. The first dive went smoothly, another titanium case hooked and pulled to shore. The second dive took longer, Morrison reporting that the cases were stacked deep, requiring careful maneuvering to avoid damaging the seals. By midnight, we'd recovered 5 cases total, and Morrison was showing signs of exhaustion. Slower movements, longer surface intervals. His breathing labored even through the suit. "One more," he said, checking his air supply. "I can make one more dive before I'm past safe limits. Then rest. We have what we have." Like hell. He was already checking his equipment, stubborn in the way people get when they're too tired to be reasonable. "There are at least 4 cases left down there. Every one we leave is one Harper gets to claim. I'm going down." I couldn't stop him. Didn't have the right to stop him when I was the one who'd asked him to risk his life in the first place. Morrison descended into the black water for the 6th time, and Brandon and I waited by the radio speaker, listening to his breathing echo through the connection. The dive started normally. The descent, the junk ring, the drop into the trench. But when Morrison reached the rail car, something in his voice changed. "The cases I already pulled out, they were the easy ones, the top layer. These last ones are wedged in deep strapped under the platform grating. I'm having trouble getting the cutting tool into position." "Come up, we have enough." "Just give me 5 more minutes." 5 minutes turned to 10. 10 turned to 15. Morrison's breathing got heavier, more labored. I heard him grunt with effort, heard the scrape of metal, heard him curse under his breath. "Got one loose. Hooking it now. Reel when I give the signal." "Jeffrey, your air. Now Rebecca. Reel now." We pulled the winch, groaning under the strain. The case rose slowly, fighting us every inch. I could hear Morrison through the radio, his breathing ragged, concerning. "Jeffrey, talk to me. Are you okay?" No response except breathing that had gone irregular too fast, the kind of pattern that meant panic or pain or both. "Jeffrey." The case breached the surface, and we wrestled it to shore. I abandoned the winch and ran to the water's edge, staring into the black depths for any sign of Morrison's lights. Nothing, just darkness and the umbilical cord of his airline stretching down and down. Brandon grabbed the radio. "Mr. Morrison, respond. Can you hear us?" Silence. Then finally, Morrison's voice came through weak and strained. "Had to. Cut myself loose. Got tangled in strapping. Air running low. Coming up. How much air do you have left?" "Maybe 5 minutes, if I'm lucky." 5 minutes from 60 feet deep. Ascending too fast would cause decompression sickness, nitrogen bubbles forming in his blood, potentially paralyzing or killing him. But staying down meant drowning when his air ran out. Morrison was trapped between two kinds of death, making calculations in the dark about which one gave him better odds. We saw his lights first diffuse glow, rising through the black water like a ghost ascending. Then his helmet broke the surface, and he was swimming for shore with strokes that looked uncoordinated, desperate. Brandon and I waded in up to our waists, grabbed his equipment harness, dragged him onto the bank. He tore off his helmet and lay there, gasping, face-pale lips tinged blue. When he tried to sit up, his left arm didn't respond properly, hanging limp at his side. "Decompression hit." His voice was slurred. "Happened during ascent. Couldn't control speed. Nitrogen bubbles forming in joints." Brandon's voice cracked. "What do we do?" "Hospital, hyperbaric chamber. Need to repressurize." Morrison struggled to his feet, swaying Brandon, catching him before he fell. "But if I go to hospital now, they'll ask questions. Injunction violation. You'll get arrested." I looked at this man who'd risked his life because I'd asked him to, who was now facing permanent paralysis, because I'd pushed for one more dive and I made the decision without hesitation. "Brandon, get him in the truck. We're going to Lexington General. They have a chamber." "Rebecca, the injunction." "I don't care about the goddamn injunction. You're going to the hospital." We loaded Morrison into his truck, Brandon driving because my hands were shaking too badly. The titanium cases, 6 of them now representing everything my father had left me, sat wrapped in tarps in the truck bed. As we pulled away from Ironwood, I took one last look at the quarry, knowing that when the state inspectors arrived in 6 hours, they'd find evidence of our work. Disturbed shoreline winch equipment. We hadn't had time to hide marks in the mud where we'd dragged cases. Harper would have his proof of violation. I'd be facing arrest fines, maybe jail time, but Morrison would live, and we had 6 cases instead of 3. And somewhere in the documents my father had sealed away was proof that would change everything if I could just figure out how to use it, before Harper's lawyers buried me in legal proceedings I couldn't afford to fight. The hospital lights of Lexington appeared on the horizon as Morrison passed out in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow but steady. Brandon drove like he'd been doing this for years. Instead of holding a learner's permit he wasn't supposed to use without supervision. And I sat in the back, my phone showing 18 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. Probably Harper's lawyer already preparing the arrest warrant. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. And anger, I was learning, was a far more useful emotion than fear. The hyperbaric chamber looked like a submarine built for one person, all riveted steel and pressure gauges and the constant hiss of compressed air. Morrison lay inside the transparent section, his face slack with exhaustion and medication, while doctors in white coats monitored readings I didn't understand. The nurse who'd admitted him had asked questions I'd answered with careful lies, Recreational diving accident equipment, malfunction, friend who'd gone too deep, too fast. She'd looked skeptical but hadn't pushed, probably, because emergency room staff in Lexington saw enough real disasters that they didn't waste energy interrogating liars. Brandon slumped in a waiting room chair, still covered in quarry mud, his eyes glazed with the kind of fatigue that comes after adrenaline burns out and leaves nothing but ash. I sat next to him, my phone vibrating every 15 minutes with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Harper's lawyers, probably. Or Sheriff Moore with an arrest warrant. Or the State Environmental Board demanding I surrender my property immediately. I let them all go to voicemail. A doctor emerged from the chamber room, stripping off latex gloves. He was young, maybe 35, with the kind of confident competence that suggested he'd seen worse cases and wasn't particularly impressed by ours. He'll live. The nitrogen bubbles are dissolving under pressure. We'll keep him in the chamber for 6 hours, then monitor him for another 12. If there's no recurrence, he can go home with instructions to avoid diving for at least 6 months. Maybe longer depending on how the nerve damage resolves. Nerve damage? My voice came out flat hollow. His left arm. The paralysis should improve as the bubbles dissipate, but there might be residual weakness. Too early to tell. The doctor studied me with eyes that had learned to read guilt on people's faces. Your friend's lucky. Another 10 minutes at depth, and he'd be dead. Whatever you were doing down there, I hope it was worth it. I thought about the titanium cases in Morrison's truck, about the proof sealed inside them, about my father's journal and patents, and the truth that had been buried for 40 years. Worth it. I didn't know yet. Ask me after Harper tried to take everything, and I'd either won or lost completely. The doctor left. Brandon and I sat in silence, listening to the chamber's mechanical breathing until Morrison's sister arrived, woman named Carol, who looked like her brother, same weathered skin and sharp eyes. She took one look at me and understood everything that mattered. You the one who hired him for the dive? Yes. He tell you about his inner ear, about how the accident on the Gulf rig damaged his equilibrium so badly he's supposed to avoid deep water. I hadn't known. Morrison had never mentioned it had just taken my money and done the work because $16,000 was more than he could refuse. Carol saw the answer on my face and nodded. He wouldn't have told you. Jeffrey's been trying to prove he's not broken since the day the company retired him on disability. Sounds like you gave him that chance. She sat down across from us, her posture mirroring her brother's stubborn defiance. Whatever you pulled out of that water, I hope you're smart enough to use it before the people who want it find a way to take it. We left the hospital at 4 a.m, Morrison stable, and his sister keeping watch. Brandon drove us back to Morrison's property where the titanium cases waited in his locked barn. The key was hidden where Morrison had told me under a specific rock by the water spigot, and we hauled the cases inside one by one each so heavy it took both of us straining to move it even a few feet. 6 cases. 6 sealed time capsules containing whatever my father had deemed important enough to preserve through 40 years of submersion. The first 3 we'd already opened their contents, documented and wrapped in plastic sheeting. But the 3 from tonight's final desperate dives remained sealed, their industrial latches still locked tight. Brandon found a pry bar in Morrison's tool collection, and we cracked the first new case together. The hiss of escaping pressure was becoming familiar, almost comforting. Inside, more gold bars, more antique coins, more perfectly preserved collectibles that represented wealth. I still couldn't quite believe was real. but tucked between the gold was something different. A sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting to Rebecca Anderson if she survives to read this. My hands shook as I tore it open. The paper inside was expensive, the ink permanent, written with the kind of care that suggested my father had composed this letter, knowing it might be the last thing he ever said to me. Rebecca, if you're reading this, it means you found the courage to dig through the poison I left you. I'm sorry. Not for leaving you ironwood that was necessary, the only way to ensure nobody else could claim what I'd hidden. But I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved, for choosing my obsession over your childhood, for driving your mother to an early grave with my paranoia and rage, for disowning you when you chose love as if love were something to punish instead of celebrate. The gold and collectibles are resources. Sell what you need to survive. Keep what you want to remember me by. But the patents, those are truth. Evidence that I wasn't crazy. That Peterson Oil and Gas stole 18 months of my work, filed it under their corporate umbrella, and made billions while calling me a thief and a madman. The journal documents everything. Dates, meetings, the stolen prototype designs. I kept copies of every blueprint, every calculation, every piece of correspondence they tried to erase. If you're reading this, you're probably facing pressure from someone who wants ironwood. They'll use the law against you. Claim environmental necessity, offer you pennies to surrender. Don't. Fight them with every tool I've left you. The patents alone are worth more than money, they're leverage. Proof that corporations steal from individuals and use legal systems to silence the truth. I've failed in life to expose what they did to me, but you're stronger than I ever was. You survived losing Ryan. You raised Brandon alone. You didn't let the world break you the way it broke me. Use that strength now. Make them acknowledge what they stole. Force them to pay not just in money, but in admission of guilt. I love you, daughter. I loved you when you were born, when you married against my wishes, when you stopped speaking to me, because I was too broken to be worth saving. I love you now, 20 years of silence later, and I will love you from whatever comes after this life ends. Forgive me if you can. Fight them whether you forgive me or not. Your father, Thomas Garrett. I read the letter 3 times before I could see through the tears. Brandon took it from my hands, gently read it himself, then wrapped his arms around me while I cried against his shoulder. All those years I'd believed my father hated me for choosing my own life. All those years of guilt and anger and the terrible certainty that I'd failed as a daughter. And he'd been loving me the whole time, just too damaged to show it, too lost in his own trauma to reach across the gap he'd created. But he'd left me weapons, not just gold, but proof, and proof was something I could use. We opened the remaining cases as dawn broke over Morrison's property. More gold, yes. More coins and watches that would sell for fortunes at auction. But also 3 file boxes of documents that my father had sealed in vacuum bags with desiccant packets, preserving them as perfectly as if they'd been stored in a climate-controlled vault, instead of buried under 60 feet of toxic water. Patent applications with Thomas Garrett's name and signature filed with the U.S. Patent Office between January 1981 and November 1982, detailed engineering blueprints for a deepwater pressure equalization valve system that could prevent blowouts on offshore drilling platforms, test results showing the valve worked beyond industry standards, correspondence between my father and Peterson Oil and Gas executives praising his innovation, promising bonuses and recognition. Then the termination letter, dated December 3rd, 1982, claiming Thomas Garrett had violated his employment contract by conducting unauthorized research, using company resources. Effective immediately. Zero severance. All work product belonging to Peterson Oil and Gas, regardless of who had originated the designs. And 6 months later, patent filings by Peterson Offshore Solutions, a subsidiary of Peterson Oil and Gas, for a novel deepwater safety valve system that was identical in every meaningful way to my father's original designs, different terminology, rearranged diagrams, but the core innovation was his, stolen, repackaged, and filed under corporate ownership, while my father fought pointless legal battles he couldn't afford. Brandon spread the documents across Morrison's workbench, photographing each one with his phone. His voice carried the quiet fury of someone seeing injustice documented in black ink on official letterhead. They destroyed him. Not just stole his work, but made sure nobody would believe him when he fought back. Fired him publicly, probably spread rumors about mental instability, made him unemployable in the industry. Then they took his life's achievement and profited from it for 40 years, while he lived in a shack and died alone. Yes, the word tasted like ashes. And now we're gonna make them pay for it. We drove back to Millbrook as the sun climbed into a clear sky that promised the kind of cold February morning where your breath freezes in the air. My phone showed 27 missed calls now, and a text message from Sheriff Moore that was almost apologetic. Rebecca Harper's lawyers filed arrest warrant. Give yourself up before noon and I can keep this civil. After that, it's out of my hands. Civil. As if anything about this was civil. As if rich men using legal systems to crush poor women was civilized instead of barbaric, dressed in paperwork. I texted back, "See you at Ironwood, 6 a.m. Bring whoever needs to witness what happens next." The quarry looked different in morning light, less like a nightmare and more like a battlefield, where we'd already won the first engagement. The shoreline showed clear evidence of our work-disturbed mud winch marks, the tracks where we'd dragged cases up the bank. Any environmental inspector would see it immediately and know we'd violated the injunction. Harper would have his proof, but proof cuts both ways, and I had documents that would redefine whose version of truth mattered. Brandon and I waited at the top of the gorge, sitting on the hood of my station wagon, watching the access road. At 5:45, the convoy arrived. State environmental inspectors in a white van. Sheriff Moore in his cruiser, looking grim, and behind them, Harper's black SUV followed by a massive yellow excavator on a flatbed truck, because Donald Harper was the kind of man who brought heavy machinery to a confrontation just to remind you how thoroughly he could erase everything you'd fought for. The inspectors were a man and woman in identical khaki uniforms with clipboard authority, the kind of functionaries who lived for regulations and saw human suffering as irrelevant to proper procedure. They photographed the shoreline, took water samples, documented every mark we'd left. The lead inspector, a thin man named Harrison, whose name badge proclaimed him Senior Environmental Specialist, approached me with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Mrs. Anderson, this site shows clear evidence of recent excavation and salvage activity conducted after the emergency injunction was filed. As per Kentucky Environmental Code Section 224.01-400, continued activity on a restricted site constitutes a Class A misdemeanor punishable by immediate arrest and property seizure." I met his eyes and didn't blink. "I'm aware of the statute. Then you understand that, as of this moment, Parcel 402B is subject to immediate state control pending full environmental assessment and remediation. Any materials recovered from this site during the violation period are considered abandoned property subject to state claim. Harper stepped forward, his smile triumphant. He'd dressed for victory again suit that cost more than my car shoes that had never touched mud, the kind of confidence that came from never losing a fight because money and lawyers made losing impossible. Rebecca, I tried to help you, offered you a fair price, a clean exit, but you chose to break the law to conduct illegal salvage operations to damage an already compromised environmental site. Now, the state will seize your property, remediate it at taxpayer expense, and auction it to recover costs. And I'll be there at that auction, ready to buy for a fraction of what I offered you initially. Sheriff Moore shifted uncomfortably his hand near his gun, but not on it, a man caught between duty and the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes law and justice weren't the same thing. He cleared his throat. Rebecca, I have the warrant. I don't want to arrest you, but if you resist the state seizure order... The sound cut through his words like a blade through silk. Low at first, then building the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of helicopter rotors echoing off the limestone walls of the gorge. We all looked up as the aircraft crested the tree line. Not a news helicopter or medical transport, but a corporate machine, black and sleek and moving with the kind of purpose that suggested this landing had been planned down to the minute. It touched down on the flat clearing 50 yards from where we stood, rotors creating a dust storm that forced everyone to cover their faces. The door opened before the blades had fully stopped, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, followed by two others in tactical gear, who moved like private security, not law enforcement. The lead man crossed the distance between us with confident strides, pulling a leather portfolio from his briefcase. He was maybe 45, black hair going gray at the temples, the kind of executive bearing that came from making decisions worth millions and sleeping soundly afterward. Mrs. Rebecca Anderson. His voice cut through the dying rotor noise. That's me. David Vance, Sr., Acquisitions Partner for Tex Global Energy Corporation. I received your documentation package approximately 4 hours ago. Photographs of patent applications, blueprint schematics, and correspondence dated 1981 through 1985 regarding deep water valve technology. He opened the portfolio, showing me photographs of the documents Brandon had sent from Morrison's barn. My CEO authorized me to fly here immediately and meet your terms. Harper's face went from triumph to confusion to rage in the space of 3 seconds. What the hell is this? What documentation? Vance ignored him completely, his attention locked on me. Mrs. Anderson, the valve system your father designed, the patents Peterson Oil and Gas filed fraudulently in 1983. Those designs form the basis for safety equipment currently used on 70% of deep-water drilling platforms worldwide. Tex Global alone has paid licensing fees to Peterson Offshore Solutions for 23 years. If you can prove prior invention and corporate theft, you're sitting on a licensing claim worth tens of millions in retroactive fees plus ongoing royalties. He pulled out a certified bank check and held it where everyone could see. The number had so many zeros, my brain stuttered trying to process it. $2 million, preliminary settlement pending full patent review. Half goes into escrow today for EPA certified environmental remediation of this site. The other half is yours immediately. Additionally, Tex Global will provide legal representation in any claims against Peterson Oil and Gas, and will negotiate ongoing licensing terms once we verify the patent priority. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant sound of the quarry water lapping against its poisoned shore. Harrison, the inspector, looked confused. Sheriff Moore looked relieved. Harper looked like someone had just reached into his chest and torn out his heart. I took the check with hands that barely shook, held it up to the morning light, watched it transform from paper into power. Then I turned to Harper and let him see exactly what his underestimation had cost him. "You asked where I got my money, Donald. This is where. My father left me something worth more than land. He left me proof. Evidence that corporations steal from individuals and hide behind legal systems to silence truth." I gestured to Vance. "Tex Global here is smart enough to see that fighting me means fighting documentation that proves Peterson committed fraud. They'd rather settle, pay fair value, and establish legal licensing through proper channels. But you just wanted to steal the land for a logging road. You never even bothered to investigate what Thomas Garrett had really hidden down there." Vance turned to Harrison. "Tex Global will fund full environmental remediation of Parcel 402B according to EPA standards. We'll hire certified contractors, provide bonded insurance, and complete the work within 6 months. Mrs. Anderson retains ownership throughout the process. The state's seizure order is unnecessary. Private remediation is already funded and approved." Harrison looked at his clipboard, then at the check Vance was already handing to him for copying and documentation. State bureaucrats lived for situations where someone else paid for expensive problems. He nodded slowly. "If you have secured private funding with bonded contractors, EPA certification, and proof of financial resources, then yes, the Environmental Code allows for private remediation in lieu of state seizure. I'll need to file updated reports, but the seizure order can be suspended pending verification of funds." Harper found his voice, and it came out strangled with fury and disbelief. "This is insane. She violated an injunction. She conducted illegal salvage. Sheriff, arrest her." Moore looked at me at Vance at the check that represented more money than Millbrook's annual budget, and made the calculation that lawmen make when power shifts beneath their feet. "Mr. Harper, the injunction was based on environmental endangerment claims. If the site is being professionally remediated with proper funding, the basis for the injunction is void. And regarding the salvage question," he paused, "that's a civil matter between Mrs. Anderson and whoever claims ownership of items recovered from her private property, not a criminal issue requiring arrest." "I claim ownership." Harper's voice went shrill. "I filed the petition. I brought the environmental board in. Anything pulled from that water during the violation period was pulled from my private property before your injunction took effect." I pulled out my phone, showed the timestamp on Brandon's photographs from the barn. All 6 titanium cases were recovered between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Your injunction was filed at 9 a.m. and served at noon. We stopped all salvage activity the moment Sheriff Moore delivered your papers. Everything we found is legally mine, recovered from my land, using my resources before any court order prohibited it. It was a lie. The last 3 cases had come up after the injunction was filed, pulled from the water, while Morrison's air ran low, and his body accumulated nitrogen bubbles that would put him in a hyperbaric chamber. But the timestamps on Brandon's photos were ambiguous, and Morrison was in a hospital room with no reason to testify against us, and the only witnesses were me and my son, who would both swear under oath that we'd stopped when ordered. Vance sealed it. Tex Global's legal team will represent Mrs. Anderson in any disputes over property rights or salvage claims. We have significant interest in ensuring her father's patents are properly authenticated and attributed. Any challenges to her ownership of materials recovered from her property will face substantial corporate resistance. Harper stood there, surrounded by the machinery he'd brought to erase me, the inspectors he'd weaponized, the sheriff he'd assumed would enforce his will, the excavator he'd hired to bury my father's secrets under concrete. All of it useless now. All of it transformed from tools of oppression into witnesses to his defeat. His voice dropped to something quiet and poisonous. "This isn't over, Rebecca. I'll find something. Some angle you missed, some mistake in your story. And when I do, then you'll spend your money on lawyers while I spend mine on remediation and Brandon's education and finally buying a winter coat that actually fits." I stepped closer to him, close enough to smell his expensive cologne, close enough to see the broken capillaries in his eyes from too much rich food and too many nights assuming the world would always bend to his will. "You wanted this land because it was convenient, because it saved you construction costs, but I need it because it's all my father left me, not just the property, but the proof that he wasn't broken, just betrayed. You can't match that kind of need with mere convenience." He left without another word, climbing into his SUV and driving away with the excavator following like a defeated army, retreating from a battlefield they should have won. The inspectors filed their paperwork, took their samples, and departed with promises of expedited approval for the remediation plan. Sheriff Moore lingered long enough to shake my hand. "Your father would be proud." He said it simply, without irony or qualification. "I hope so." Vance and his security team stayed for another hour, going over contracts and licensing terms and environmental timelines. Tex Global would handle the cleanup not out of generosity, but because having clean hands on the patent claim meant they needed the site restored properly, all evidence documented, all processes transparent. They'd hire contractors who knew what they were doing, transform Ironwood from a toxic nightmare into something that could be called a lake again instead of a crime scene. The money hit my account by noon, verified by 3 different banking systems, because sums that large required redundant confirmation. $1 million after the escrow hold for remediation. More money than I'd make in 70 years of waiting tables. More money than my father had ever seen in his life. Not enough to call it wealth by Harper's standards, but enough to mean Brandon could go to any college he wanted, that I could buy a house instead of renting a trailer, that the future had stopped being a series of catastrophes I had to survive and become something I might actually choose. But the money wasn't why I was sitting on the hood of my car at Ironwood, watching the sun climb higher, feeling something like peace settle into my bones for the first time since Ryan died. The money was just proof that the world could be forced to acknowledge truth when you fought hard enough and refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational option. My father had been right. About the theft, about the corporations, about the need to hide proof so completely that only someone desperate and stubborn would dig for it. But he'd also been wrong about me. About love, about whether choosing your own life meant betraying the people who'd raised you. I'd spent 20 years believing his silence was judgment, but his silence had just been pain, and pain makes people cruel even to those they love most. Brandon climbed up next to me, his phone showing an email from MIT's admissions office inviting him to interview for their early acceptance program. His essay about finding truth buried under poison had apparently impressed someone. He showed me the email, his face trying to stay neutral, even though I could see the hope burning underneath. "You're going." I said it flat, certain no room for argument. "Mom, MIT costs? We have the money, and you earned this, not by pulling cases out of a lake, but by being smart enough to see patterns everyone else missed, by being brave enough to investigate when I wanted to give up. Your grandfather left this for both of us, but you're the one who figured out what it meant." 6 months later, Ironwood Quarry no longer looked like a wound in the earth. The remediation contractors had drained the water, excavated contaminated soil, hauled away decades of rusted metal and rotting tires. They'd restored the limestone walls, revegetated the slopes, and refilled the basin with clean water pumped from tested wells. It would take years for the ecosystem to fully recover, but already I'd seen birds returning, watched fish fingerlings darting through shallows that had been lifeless black poison. The transformation wasn't just physical. Tex Global's lawyers had negotiated a settlement with Peterson Oil and Gas, not an admission of wrongdoing. They were too careful for that, but an official acknowledgement that Thomas Garrett had made foundational contributions to deep-water valve technology, plus retroactive licensing fees that added another $3 million to my accounts, and ongoing royalties that would continue as long as offshore drilling existed. I donated a portion to establish the Thomas Garrett Engineering Scholarship at the University of Kentucky, funding for students who showed promise but lacked resources. The kind of program my father could have used when he was young and brilliant and full of ideas that would eventually be stolen from him. The quarry itself I kept. Not because it was valuable as property, it wasn't. Not really, but because it was where my father had chosen to hide his truth, and that meant something. I'd had a memorial plaque installed at the site overlook simple granite, with words I'd agonized over for weeks before settling on the only ones that mattered. Thomas Garrett, 1949 to 2025. Engineer. Father. His integrity could not be buried. Brandon had left for MVRT in August, calling twice a week, with stories about classes and projects and people who spoke his language of mathematics and physics and elegant solutions to complex problems. He'd made friends. He was happy. He was becoming the person my father might have been if bitterness hadn't consumed him. Morrison had recovered fully, his arm regaining most of its function, though he claimed he could still predict weather changes by the ache in his shoulder. Carol had helped him start a diving school that trained young people in safe practices and proper equipment maintenance. He'd sent me a photo of his first graduating class, 10 kids holding certification cards, Morrison grinning in the middle like a proud father. As for me, I'd bought a small house in Millbrook proper, 3 bedrooms, and a yard where I could grow tomatoes. I still worked at Miller's Diner, not because I needed the money, but because Linda had stood by me when the whole town was laughing and loyalty meant something. I worked morning shifts only now, left my afternoons free for reading and gardening, and learning to be a person whose survival wasn't constantly at stake. Harper. I'd seen exactly once since the confrontation passing him on Main Street, where he was climbing out of a BMW that had replaced the SUV. He'd looked older, diminished somehow, a man learning that being rich didn't make you invincible when someone poorer refused to accept inevitable defeat. We'd locked eyes for 3 seconds, acknowledged each other's existence without words, and moved on. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate required energy I'd decided to spend elsewhere. I stood at the Ironwood Overlook on a Saturday morning in late August, watching sunlight turn the restored water from blue to gold. Somewhere 60 feet down, the empty railcar still sat where my father had scuttled it, stripped now of its secrets, just a rusted steel container filling with silt and time. Eventually, it would dissolve completely, becoming part of the quarry floor, indistinguishable from the limestone that had been here for millions of years before my father's paranoia and my desperation had transformed this place into a battlefield. But for now, it remained a memorial to a man who'd been broken by the world and had still found a way to fight back. Who'd loved his daughter enough to leave her weapons disguised as disasters. Who'd trusted that even across 20 years of silence, blood would recognize blood and stubbornness would triumph over surrender. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Ace the thermodynamics midterm. Professor wants me for her research project. Miss you, Mom. I texted back. Proud of you. Your grandfather would be too. And standing there above the water that had hidden truth for 40 years, I finally let myself believe it was true. Thomas Garrett would be proud, not just of Brandon's brilliance or my victory over Harper, but of the fact that we'd survived, that we'd refused to let the world's cruelty make us cruel, that we'd found what he'd hidden and used it not just for wealth, but for justice, for acknowledgement, for the kind of truth that transforms shame into vindication. The quarry water reflected clouds drifting overhead, peaceful and clean, and nothing like the toxic void it had been. In the end, my father hadn't left me a disaster. He'd left me a test one that required me to be stronger, smarter, and more stubborn than I'd ever imagined I could be. And I'd passed. Not because I was special or chosen or destined for anything, but because when the world tried to bury me under circumstances I didn't deserve and debts I'd never earned, I'd made the decision that divides the defeated from the defiant. I'd chosen to dig. And when you dig deep enough through enough poison and darkness and seemingly impossible weight, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you hit something solid, something true, something worth the cost of all those blistered hands and broken nights. I turned from the overlook and walked back to my car, leaving Ironwood behind but carrying my father's legacy forward. Not the gold or the patents or the money that would never run out in my lifetime, but the lesson he'd paid for with 40 years of isolation and a death alone. The lesson that truth is worth burying if it means the right person will eventually dig it up. That love can survive silence if it's fierce enough. That the powerful can be beaten if the powerless refuse to stay down. And most importantly, that sometimes the inheritance that saves you isn't the one anyone expected. Not wealth or property or anything that can be counted or measured, but simply the stubborn refusal to accept that your story has to end the way powerful people have written it. The knowledge that you have permission to fight back, and the proof sealed and hidden and waiting in the dark that you were right to do so.